A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Today on the program, we're veering off talking about wars in Europe and the Middle East to focus on Africa. And that's because this week, the Berlin Conference of November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885 turns 140 years. The Berlin Conference formalized the scramble for Africa, launching a wave of colonial domination that would exploit the continent's people and resources for decades. So, on the program today is a lesson in history and international relations. Our lecturer is convener of the Fatherland Group, which incidentally has an event coming up in the first week of November this year, where the Berlin Conference and its resultant impact will be discussed in detail. That's coming up after a quick check and other discussions in diplomatic circles.
The Nigerian Minister of Interior, Dr. Olubunmi Tunji-Ojo, has announced that the federal government will be cancelling Nigeria's visa on arrival policy and introduce landing and exit cards which prospective visitors will pre-fill before coming into the country. The visa on arrival policy, a class of short-stay visas issued at the point of entry, took effect in 2020. Now, the government says the policy would henceforth be based on reciprocity.
We believe that it's better for us to take decisions based on objectivity rather than subjectivity. And of course, that will lead to the cancellation of the visa on arrival process. Because the visa on arrival, we understand it's not a system that works. Because I don't expect you to just come to my country without me knowing that you're coming into my country. No, it's never done anywhere.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says he would be willing to give up his presidency in exchange for peace ahead of the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of his country. He was responding to questions during a press conference earlier today. Mr. Zelensky's remarks come after US President Donald Trump called him a dictator. He said he was not offended, but is currently focused on Ukraine's security, and it is not his dream to remain president for a decade.
February 26th of 2025 will make it 140 years since the Berlin Conference, or going by the title by which it was taught in university, if you studied history, the scramble for Africa. How has the continent been impacted by the outcome of the conference and our present challenges as a result of the agreement by these European leaders? I'd like to bring in Dele Ogun of the think tank Fatherland Group, a strong think tank on Nigerian and world affairs, which started in 2017. It promotes the Orange Union philosophy as the key to African development. Dele joins us from London. Thank you for joining us on the program today, Dele.
Thank you, Amarachi. Pleasure to be with you.
Now, this is not a topic that a lot of Africans and, dare I say, Nigerians know about. There's just the common knowledge that Nigeria was colonized by the British, but there's very little awareness how that happened. How it is that these European countries did not fight any wars over partition in Africa, but 140 years, that's a really long time. Now, you're a bit of a historian yourself, as I am. So let's begin with a basic question, which is, what was the Berlin Conference about and why was it held?
No, they came with the narrative, and we grew up with the narrative that we Africans were always fighting, were killing ourselves. It could not be further from the truth. The truth was that it was actually the Europeans who were always fighting and killing themselves. They had fought themselves to a standstill over land in Europe. So, for example, countries like Poland disappeared from the map for ages. Countries like Lithuania disappeared from the map for an eternity as they were being partitioned between Prussia and Russia on the one side. They then fought themselves to a standstill over India, and they repeated the same exercise over the Americas. Constant, incessant slaughter and bloodshed for land which was not theirs. So when now it came to the last remaining continent, which was Africa, which they had not carved up between themselves, uh, they did not want to, they agreed between themselves that they don't want to repeat of the bloodshed that they had inflicted upon one another when it came to sharing Africa. And so that was the backdrop to the conference that was convened in Berlin in 1884. The conference started on on the 15th of November, 1884, and they finished their deliberations 4 months later on the 26th of February, 1885. And those who were participants in this conference, those who were around the table, were the following countries. The principal players: Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, and Italy. But these seconds, if you can imagine seconds in the corner of a boxing ring to observe the carve up, were Austria-Hungarian Empire, the Union of Sweden and Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Turkey, the United States of America, and Tsarist Russia. These ones were effectively attended as observers and escorts. So it was a grand conspiracy, a grand alliance with the map of Africa across the table. And they deliberated almost as if you were at a dining table, Christmas party, and some are lobbying for the wing, and some are lobbying for the drumstick. This is how Africa was carved up. And if our governance was as it should be, this anniversary would have been something that leaders across Africa would have been focusing upon and raising awareness. The 140th anniversary is not a small anniversary.
Yes, I'm not sure that there are any anniversaries coming up or any major events marking the conference itself 140 years after. Now, one of the major concerns that I hear about the conference is how no African country was represented. Do you think that that would have made any difference in the way the continent was petitioned, or would it have been a major obstacle to those plans by the European leaders?
It was never a prospect, never in prospect that an African voice should be heard at that table. It's a bit like a turkey at Christmas, using my Christmas analogy, the turkey having a say as to how it should be carved up. We were on the menu. Africa was the menu. This is what they were discussing between themselves. What is the sharing formula? Who's going to get what, and on what principles to be applied? So there was never a prospect of an African voice registering in that discussion. Now, you say that, and you're quite right, that this anniversary would have passed us by without a few of us thinking about something needs to be done. And in November this year, maybe we'll come to it later. In November this year in Lagos, we are having a 1 week long conference to revisit, to study what was discussed, study the records, because whenever they confer like that, they always keep records. But we've never, again, there's a reflection on African leadership. We've never sat down. So what did they discuss exactly? How has it impacted the African story? And what is the way forward? So that will be November this year.
It would have been great, to have studied this in secondary school. Unfortunately, here in Nigeria, history has been withdrawn from the curriculum. I think it was brought back in at some time, but the curriculum for history is a bit restrictive this time. And I remember the days of my youth service corps. It was mainly the history of the northern part of the country that was of more interest to the people that I was serving, because I served somewhere in the north. I'm not sure that history these days goes deeper into conferences like this or major events in history, especially where Africa was put in bad light. But I guess that what you were saying earlier further perpetrates the Orange Union philosophy that I mentioned earlier, that the Fatherland Group perpetrates, which is to ensure the full self-determination of each ethnic nation and to provide a platform for joint collaborations on equitable terms.
Yes, indeed, because you see, before this conference of 1884 and the measures they then took pursuant to the conference, out of which countries like Nigeria were born, Ghana was born, Kenya was born, all the countries across Africa. You see, the identities that we had were cancelled. The thousands of organic ethnic groups under which we were governed were cancelled as a result of this conference. And we've got new identities that were given to us. And this is what we have been running with. What we say is that the Fatherland Group, looked at the record of governance and development across Africa since the European intervention. And we know that it's not as it should be. And we say to us, what is the way forward? And we say that before 1900, for example, when Nigeria was created, when 371 ethnic groups were poured into this new identity, this new mold made by the Europeans, each of those 371 ethnic groups had their own governance system. They had their models, and everybody knew their boundaries. So what the Orange Union philosophy says is that the way forward is the way back. We've got to get back to the way we were before the colonial confusion. And the reason we say that that's the way forward is simply look at what the Europeans themselves are doing and how they've governed themselves. Because similarly, as a result of all these conflicts that I referenced at the beginning, many of their nations disappeared from the map over periods. A country like Lithuania, for example, you couldn't find it on a map between 1795 and 1915. It was subsumed under the identity of the Russian Empire. But if you look at the map now, you see them, Lithuania, Belarus, they've all popped up because they've all pursuing the Orange Union principle of the self-governance and self-determination of ethnic groups. It is the only way to undo the colonial experience, really. So that underpins our formula. And even I always say that, look, the prime example is Britain itself, where they have climbed a mountain to political union, their equivalent of one Nigeria, as at 1707. That's when the United Kingdom was formed, and they had one government for the Scots, the English, the Welsh, and the Irish. But then in 1997, Tony Blair introduced a new legislation that created a parliament for the Welsh, a parliament for the Scottish, a parliament for the Irish, such that they're going back to the Orange Union principle, which was always the way Africa governed itself, as I said before this Berlin conference.
So how will the Orange Union system of governance, how will that work in modern times? Because it does seem we've moved past that. It's a long way behind. If you're talking about pre-1900 conditions here in Africa, how do we migrate to something that used to work and from something that we are already used to working with?
Yes, the principle, we've got to agree the principle first, whether the idea is correct, and then you then move on to how do you get there. Starting with the principle has to be right, because if, as I say, the British, who were the architects of Nigeria, if they could go back to 1707, in their case, our journey back is much shorter, is 1900. But we also, in the Fatherland Group, we recognize that Nigerians actually don't hate each other. It's the competition for the one seat that creates the conflict and the corruption that comes with it. That what we want to do is to have a union that is positive and constructive. And we say the way you get to a positive and constructive union is to respect every single ethnic group that makes up the union. Don't stop pretending that we're one because you're looking for a Superman or a Superwoman who can be all things to all people. And such a person is nothing to everyone. That's just a reality. It's a vacuum it creates. So instead of trying to outdo these Europeans who gave us this unworkable model, do what they do, which is they, as I said, they create governance systems whereby, take for example the European Union, you have the Union, but a Frenchman runs France, a German runs Germany, and an Italian runs Italy. That is nature, and that's how the orange is constructed. That's why we use the Orange Union concept, that when you look at the way the orange fruit is constructed, it's segments, but they're all like good neighbors, they make the whole, supportive and constructive. But the skin represents the union. And in terms of how we get there, it is really quite simple. It's just raising awareness, education in terms of the possibility. Because if you're not exposed to what is the alternative, you think that what you've got is the only way forward. Whereas what we're saying in the Fatherland group is that look across the world, look how they govern themselves. Everybody has their own little seat. Belgium can have a little one. France is much bigger, has big one, but they're all part of a unit. So it's not difficult at all, and it's not a long way back, certainly much shorter than our European counterparts have traveled.
At the time that these artifacts were looted, the Benin Empire stretched beyond Benin City itself, stretched beyond Benin States down to Yoruba land and so on. And that does not exist anymore. Now you have states, and now kings and obas and emirs are all confined to a small space of geography where they operate from. Interesting. Let's talk about how this has impacted politics on the continent. Now, I see that many of the countries in Africa are tending towards democracy or some form of it, even though some have bastardized it. We have democracy turning into dynasties in some African states. Would you say that this is as a result of the partitioning, or, African leaders are just a different breed of politicians?
Only in the sense that, in reality, African leaders are merely proteges of these colonial powers, because it's almost like somebody was running a slave plantation, and you appoint somebody as the overseer, the general overseer of the plantation. And when you're recruiting the person you're going to appoint, your focus, you the person appointing them, your focus is your interest. So Nigeria not being the creation of Nigerians, but the creation of Britain, for example, the processes by which somebody will emerge as the manager, leader, overseer of that estate was shaped fundamentally by the British colonial powers. And so therefore, what we find is that the vision of these leaders, to the extent that they have a vision, has simply been to keep the estate running, to keep the business running. There's no organic vision because, as I say, it wasn't the creation of our own people. Now, also, you see, when it comes to these, when you look at the record of governance of these that we've had, if you look at the way the states are created in Nigeria, this was a carryover from the Berlin Conference, because you find that the internal boundaries for our states, our 36 states, were drawn up in exactly the same way as the external boundaries were drawn in Berlin, without regard to the actual organic units that are caught up within them. So you have a situation where members of the same ethnic group are on either side of borders, of even our 36 states, which is exactly what they did in Berlin when they were drawing the boundaries, say, for example, of Nigeria, where you have Yoruba on one side, in Benin Republic, and you have Yoruba on the other side. And you go to the north, you find that that's why our president Buhari, on one side was these Daura people, on the other side was the other side of his family in Niger. So that was replicated when it came to the shaping of the state within Nigeria. So it's the Berlin factor that is afflicting us, both in terms of our external boundary and also our internal borders, and reflected in the misgovernance. So it's all part of the Berlin legacy.
And we cannot talk about the Berlin Conference without moving forward to discuss imperialism and some say neocolonialism in the form of trade agreements that exist today. How should Africa negotiate her future?
As I said, the way forward is the way back. Colonialism hasn't ended so long as we are running with the structures that they left in place. So, as I said, that they dug up and cancelled the ethnic groups, which were our organic units of governance. These have existed for thousands of years. It's like a building that's hundreds of years, centuries old, and you compare it with a fabricated building that's just thrown up in a matter of a few hours without regard to the culture of the occupants or the aspirations and the value systems of the culture. We've been left with an open plan living, whereas we all had separate rooms. And those separate rooms gave us peace of mind. We decorated it in the way we wanted to decorate it. And instead, we've got all the internal borders knocked down. So as long as that remains the case, until we re-engineer it for ourselves along the lines of the Orange Unit, whereby we go back to the way we were before the colonial intrusion, keeping only those elements of the larger structure that we think are actually serving us. So yeah, there are advantages of scale and there are advantages of doing things together. But the idea that we must do everything together is what has arrested our development. And when we look at countries like Singapore and look at countries like Malaysia, the reason why they don't have to keep going on about colonialism is because they reconfigured the legacy that they were left with. Remember, they were members of Southeast Asian Federation, but they now re-engineered it to give themselves the space, going back to the Orange Union principle, whereby then they were just good neighbors. And that's the essence of the Orange Union philosophy, that we don't naturally hate ourselves. It's a matter of just going back to being good neighbors. And good neighbors requires each of us has our own space, our own room, which is just ours.
Don't want us to end this conversation with a bad taste in our mouth about imperialism and colonialism. There were some advantages, and it might be a good point here to highlight some of those in the sense that the colonial masters, especially here in Nigeria, did bring some good. What would you consider good in this instance?
Well, first of all, Amarachi, always reject the tag of colonial masters. Heavens no. Slave masters, colonial masters, they were not our masters. They were colonial, I call them colonial Confucianists, if you like, colonialists, colonial trespassers, but never masters. Now, was there anything good that came out of them? I struggle to see it, to be honest. I really struggle to see it, because you don't pick a particular item and say, yes, this was good. You look at everything in the balance. You and I are now, this positive can be, you as I believe, an Igbo woman, I as a Yoruba man, we're communicating through their language. But we could have communicated through our own languages as well. So is that really a positive? And what else would you look to? when the core for development is being your true self, is being grounded in your identity, grounded in your history, grounded in your inheritance from your ancestors. Now, any arrangement that detaches us from who we are, it's difficult to say that there's benefits. Yes, individuals may be enjoying some nice cars that they import in from abroad and wearing nice clothes made abroad. But what about the flip side of that? What about what you've lost in terms of what we could have done for ourselves? That's so I struggle to see it. Somebody may be able to point it out to me, but I struggle to see it. Let them not say, "Hey, what about all the books behind you, etc." We will have written those books in our own language. That's why you have translation work. So, in my view, I can't see any positive, but I'm open to persuasion.
Well, here's what's interesting, that when books are translated, they're not translated into Nigerian languages. Many books are translated into more foreign languages than they are to local languages. And that is because many people don't know how to read in their local languages. Wow, food for thought. Dele, it's been a real pleasure having you on the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
This is where we end the program today. Let me know how you think Africa has been impacted by the Berlin Conference and if the continent can ever move past its impact. The social media addresses to reach me on are on your screen. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.